Good evening to everyone. So in the serial of Vijnana Ganga, this is the 8th lecture. We started in March 2016. Now today's topic is going to be fifth force. Little bit more academic type of lecture. But then we know gravitational force, we know electromagnetic force, we know strong and weak nuclear force. So far we do not know what is the fifth force. But the scientists are working all the time on this, not only at Western countries, but even in our country and especially in Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. And that is why the person who has worked some 20 years, 25 years back in this particular field, Professor N. Krishnan, has been invited over here to deliver a speech, give us the idea what is the fifth force, what are the symptoms of it, what's going to be its use and all that he will explain. I'll just briefly introduce him. Professor Nanathur Krishnan joined TIFR in 1981 after his MSc in physics from IIT Kanpur, and he took his doctoral degree working on an early torsion balance experiment that searched sensitively for a fifth fundamental force. While that experiment did not find such a force, it was successful in imposing what were then the world's best limits of some varieties of the fifth force. He now leads the TIFR test of the equivalence principle, a cornerstone of the general theory of relativity, an experiment being conducted at the Institute's unique underground laboratory at Guribandar in Karnataka. His general interests include gravitation and relativity, fundamental particle interactions, optics and instrumentation. He has always had a keen interest in pursuit of delicate and sensitive experiments, some of which you will hear about in the course of his present talk. So now I invite Professor Krishnan to deliver his speech. Thank you. We will felicitate Professor Krishnan for the hands of Mr. Sarath Kare. Oh, thank you.
So thank you for the introduction, Dr. Deshpande, and thank you for inviting me to come here and give this talk. I will explain why it is that I have come around to give this talk, but some of this is also obvious from the introduction that I was given. My talk is entitled Searching for a Fifth Force, New Stirrings in an Old Pot. And the reason for this is that in recent times there has been a lot of suddenly recharged interest in this whole question of whether there is a fifth force, and I will try and tell you exactly what stirred that interest and made people start looking at the question all over again. So how did I come to be giving this talk? Well, the most important part is, of course, Dr. Deshpande's own personal drive. He got in touch with a famous old scientist who used to be in Ayuka. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, then perhaps you have to do a little bit of your scientific general knowledge for the country. You have to work it up again. But anyway, through a route starting that way, the query came to me whether I could be giving this talk. And so, of course, I am going to be giving this talk, as is obvious. But also, Deshpandeji's information, probably we have to blame the newspapers and the internet for that, because the newspapers also played up something big sometime in August. So, of course, the newspapers and the internet cater to the public hunger for interesting new things in science. Let us see if there is something interesting that we can talk to the people about. That's the general idea. Okay, so here there are some few of these headlines. I looked at them recently. They're still up over there. So one of these is on the website of the Nature magazine, and it says, "Has a Hungarian physics lab found the fifth force of nature?" And then the subtitling is, "Radioactive decay anomaly could imply a new fundamental force, theorists say." Now these theorists are American. The experimental work was done by people in a lab in Hungary. Okay, so now what about the next one? There is another one at this website called cnet.com. It says, "Let's slow down talk of a fifth fundamental force of nature." So they are suggesting, don't start getting overly excited until we get to know a little bit more about it. So what do they say? A new discovery could upend our understanding of particle physics and the forces driving the universe. And then here is the kicker, last one. It says, unless it's all just based on a goof. Okay. Now I would not be so disrespectful towards what I now regard as a very good experiment, but it is perfectly possible that this fifth force may be in error. This judgment that there is a fifth force, that may be in error. Okay, now the last of these that I'm going to show you, it says a fifth force of nature. We'll try to explain. This is on voanews.com. You may have seen some headlines this week about the discovery of a fifth fundamental force of nature. Maybe you even read a bit about it, but then probably quit reading because particle physics, quanta, bosons, force carriers, all of these ... they just go over your head. So maybe that's the suggestion that is being made over there. But notice that these are all, this 25th May, Nature grabbed onto this whole thing. That's because this paper had been published by the Hungarians in January 2016, and then the theorists had something to say by about May. So, but the other newspapers and other websites started talking about it in August. Okay, so now some of the questions that you've probably been wondering about. Why do we talk about a fifth force? What are the other four forces that take precedence ahead of the fifth force? Okay, and what does a physicist mean when she talks about fundamental forces? See, one of the previous things over here, it says a fifth fundamental force of nature, right? So what is the meaning of fundamental force? Actually, even more basic, what is the physicist's picture by which force operates in nature? Okay, and is the present phenomenon, this Hungarian-American statement about the existence of a fifth force, is it very new? Or is there a history of fifth forces? Well, actually, Deshpande ji just revealed the fact that we worked on fifth forces. Some 30 years ago, we started working on it and had some results on it. So there is a history, and actually the history is probably even older. Okay, now the next question that perhaps you have wondered about is, will it trouble us greatly to have a new force? And can our theoretical structures accommodate something like this, a new force, right? And finally, will it solve any outstanding problems? I mean, I don't mean problems within the sociological sphere or the political sphere or maybe even India-Pakistan problems and so on, but are there any problems that it can solve? Okay, so is there something that we can think about? Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about some basics, some things which you should know. There are four well-studied fundamental forces. There's something known as a strong interaction, and if its strength is considered as unit, then electromagnetism, which is another distinct force which has a different kind of behavior, that is about 100 times weaker than the strong interaction. The weak interaction is very much weaker than the strong interaction. That's why it's called the weak interaction. And then there is gravity, which is 10 to the power 42 times weaker than the strong interaction. It's so horribly weak, so incredibly weak, 1 followed by 42 zeros in the denominator. Okay, that large a number, and yet it turns out that it is what dominates the universe in most things. And for the reason, and I'll tell you about it. Now, these four are fundamental interactions in the sense that they operate between the elementary particles. Of course, all of you know about elementary particles. I mean, you know about protons, neutrons, electrons, neutrinos. There's something even more fundamental than the protons and the neutrons, and these are the quarks. So these interactions actually operate between particles which are at that elementary level. So you have matter particles which are classified into categories called hadrons, and you have things which are called leptons, and all of them are governed by one or the other kind of force amongst these that we have listed over here. Okay. Now these fundamental interactions, they are not restricted to operating only between elementary particles, they also operate between collections of elementary particles. So you can put together many elementary particles and make a non-elementary particle, and that non-elementary collection will interact with some other non-elementary collection through one or the other of these forces. So most phenomena that we know so far, and this is all kinds of things, as the next thing I will tell you indicates, most phenomena that we know are explained and understood in terms of these basic or fundamental interactions. For example, the dominant force in most daily phenomena is that of electromagnetism. Chemistry and therefore biology is pretty much explained by electromagnetism as the dominant force. I mean, there are structures which tell you how to use this as the force and how to explain things with it. I mean, for example, you want quantum mechanics to explain chemistry at the most fundamental level, but that's okay. I mean, that's not a theory of an interaction. Here is the interaction, and that quantum mechanics tells you, if you give me the interaction and you tell me what kind of force law it is, then I will tell you how to make up your atoms and how to talk about atoms making molecules and so on and so forth. If you have chemistry, then we of course have biology. At least that's the conceit of any scientist, that biology can be explained. So this is the reductionist approach, that there is nothing which cannot be understood in terms of the very basics. So you keep reducing and you will come up with the basics. And for example, my wife may not agree with me that the reductionist approach is something which will eventually explain everything. But most of us as scientists have this particular conceit. The van der Waals interaction is something which again depends on electromagnetism. Friction, you can talk about it in terms of the electrostatic forces between bodies. The strength of buildings, this building that we stand on, the floor is not falling. It can support all our weight. There are some 50 people here and nothing is happening. All of that is also basically because of the electromagnetic force. Now the elephant in the room is gravity, and it governs all the gross phenomena in the universe. Basically, the reason is that electromagnetism, which is 10 to the power 40 times stronger than gravity, cannot operate in the universe in the large because matter is electrically neutral. So there is no charge, no net charge between two large bodies. I mean, the earth is not fundamentally charged and interacting with the sun because it has electric charge. The net charge on the earth is zero, the net charge on the sun is zero, and so earth and sun cannot interact electrically. And the strong interaction and the weak interaction basically have extremely short range, and so gravity is the thing that operates everywhere. Now I want to talk to you about another basic aspect. There are particles of matter, and then there are particles which are the particles that generate interactions. Okay? So I have already told you about some of the kinds of matter. I have told you about neutrons and protons, or even more basic things which are called quarks. The interactions I have already told you about at the gross level in terms of the names, that is these interactions over here. But the interactions, here is a picture I am going to try and indicate to you about how the interactions happen. So here is a matter particle and here is another matter particle, and the two are talking to each other through the exchange of some particle. And that particle, for example, in the case of the electromagnetic interaction, that particle that is being exchanged is actually a photon. But it is not a real photon. This is a funny world, and I don't want to get too deeply into this because that will be a lecture in its own right. What is the meaning of this not real gauge boson or not real photon? It's a virtual photon, and it gets exchanged between this particle, the blue particle, and this particle. I don't know what color this is over here, probably green. And through the exchange of this virtual particle, the virtual photon, this particle is able to tell that particle, I am here and I am so far away from you, the interaction is so much. Now how does it work? Okay, so I have already introduced a name over here, I have called it a gauge boson. Okay, so with each one of these interactions, the strong interaction, electromagnetic interaction, weak interaction, we know the identity of the gauge boson that is in question. We have seen it, experiments have indicated this without any doubt. That is individual gauge bosons. However, in the case of gravity, which is terribly weak, the gauge bosons, you cannot see single gauge bosons. It is just once again part of our model of the universe and our understanding of the universe, which tells us that gravity must also have a gauge boson, and that gauge boson is conveniently called the graviton. Here I have already told you this is called the photon. Here what you have are things called gluons, and over here you have the W and the Z bosons, which were discovered in experiments in CERN about 30 years ago. Okay, so these gauge bosons, the energy for them, for creating them, is borrowed from what we have as an idea of the vacuum in quantum field theory. It is borrowed from somewhere, but borrowed for only long enough that the experimenter is not able to detect that that borrowing has taken place. It is returned back to the vacuum. So, so there is a time delta t over which you can grab a little amount of energy delta E such that the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is obeyed, and this therefore naturally leads to a limit on the amount of time delta t for which this particle of mass m can exist. So what happens is that automatically, because of this kind of a picture, you get an interaction between two particles, the blue particle and the green particle, which goes as 1 by r, and if this lambda, if the mass over here is finite, then lambda is a finite number, and then what happens is that you have an exponential damping. So normally when you have studied gravity and electromagnetism, you know that the interaction potential just goes as 1 upon r, and the force goes as 1 upon r squared, because the force is the first derivative of the potential. But in the case of other forces, for example, the gauge boson that is involved over here, the gluon, has a mass which is on the order of about 100 million electron volts. The weak interaction, the mass is on the order of about 90 giga electron volts, 100 giga electron volts, and as a consequence, the range of this force becomes limited. Okay, so this is a general picture, but I want to point out two specific things over here. There is a factor F over here which tells you how strong the interaction is in its own intrinsic terms, and there is a factor over here lambda, which is the range of the force. Okay. Now with this vocabulary, we can try to talk about what was the experiment that the Hungarian scientists did, and we will try to understand it. Now they did a nuclear physics experiment using the tools of nuclear physicists. What did they do? They bombarded some cleverly chosen targets with a beam of energetic particles, and then they very carefully studied what came out from that explosion. That bombarding led to some interaction happening in the interaction zone, and then some things came spraying out from there, and so they studied those with their detectors. So here is a schematic picture of their experimental apparatus. The beam of protons that is incident on this target comes along in this direction. So just imagine that this is a beam pipe within which a target has been kept. The target has lithium fluoride or lithium oxide, and I'll tell you why lithium is involved in them. So the beam comes, energetic protons come and hit the lithium over here, and then there is an explosion, if you like, and then there are things which are flying off in all directions, here, 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 everywhere, and then you have a very specific structure of detector which is intended to find out what are these particles which are coming out of that interaction. So here you have something called a multi-wire proportional counter, which tells you that if a particle is going from here, it tells you exactly what are the coordinates of the particle, which part of this detector it has gone through. Then you have something which tells you, which helps you find out the identity of the particle, and something over here which tells you what is the total amount of energy that was available in the particle. So you have found out everything. You have found out which direction the particle has gone in, whether it has gone here or somewhere else. You've been able to find that out. You've been able to find out what is the identity through this sub-detector, and then through this you've been able to tell what is the total energy. Now these detectors are all set up in the plane which is orthogonal to the direction in which the beam is propagating. Beam is coming in from here, and around it you don't have detectors which are set up directly in the pathway of the beam. You're only picking up the products in the directions which are orthogonal to it. And there's a reason for this. We'll talk about that also. So now this is a picture of the apparatus. These things are the detectors, which I had shown schematically over here. The beam is coming into the system from here. So the beam is basically generated from what is called a Van de Graaff accelerator. The projectile is protons, and the energy of the proton beam can be chosen at will. Okay. So now this is a very busy slide, and this is probably the heart of this particular experiment. So I would request you to please pay a little bit of attention, careful attention. You can ask me questions. By the way, if there is any question that you want to ask during the lecture, please don't feel shy about asking. Please stop me and I will be happy to answer. So there is a nuclear energy level for the lithium-7, which is present in the target. And there's this proton which is coming in as a projectile. The energy level of this particular lithium-7 nucleus is 17.25 million electron volts on some standard. Okay, so nuclear physicists have done experiments now for something like close to about 90 years. And for every nucleus, every isotope, they know what are the ground state levels, what are the excited state levels, and so on and so forth. And they know it in relation to other nuclear species to which these particular species can be transmuted. So lithium-7 can become beryllium-8 if it picks up a proton. As you see, the mass has gone up by 1 atomic mass unit because the proton has come in. So, and they know the relationship between this ground state level for the lithium and the ground state level for the beryllium. Okay. So they have done spectroscopic measurements, details of which we need not worry about. But anyway, so here is the idea. So you have lithium-7 and the protons which are coming in, and if you choose the proton energy correctly, if you make the beam 0.441 or 441 kilo electron volt beam, then you will preferentially populate this excited level of beryllium. If you have about 1 MeV or 1000 kilo electron volts proton beam, then you will preferentially populate this level. Now, what happens when you have a population of lithium going up either into this level or into that level? These are excited states. So just as you have in the case of the atom, you would tend to decay and come down to the ground state or to lower energy levels within the level diagram of this system. I have simplified this. There are many more levels which are actually sitting in over here. But the important things to be noted are this transition from the upper excited state of beryllium to the ground state, and this transition from the lower excited state of beryllium to the ground state. Now there are some decay widths associated with this, which is related to the lifetime in which for which these levels can remain populated. Okay, so now I've told you that there is a possibility of selective population of the excited levels of beryllium. I can either choose to go here or I can choose to go here, depending upon what I do with the energy of the incoming proton beam. Most of these excited states, they don't decay down here. They just break up back again to go back to become lithium-7 and proton. So that's what happens over there. Neither of these excited states, neither this 8 beryllium star nor 8 beryllium star prime decays readily to the ground state through the emission of gamma radiation. By the way, can you, let me ask you this question. Can I decay from this excited state of beryllium down to the ground state of beryllium through the emission of an electron? Can we? No idea. Okay. No, you cannot, because if you did it, then there would be something going wrong with the species, right? Because, for example, if you were to emit an electron, then essentially what is happening is that a neutron has broken up into a proton and an electron. So the proton count over here would have increased and you would have gone into a different species. Okay. So it would no longer be beryllium. Okay. So similarly, you cannot, for example, decay from here to here through the emission of, let us say, an alpha particle. Okay. Because then the alpha particle has a mass number of 4 and a charge number of 2. So that is to say it has 2 neutrons, 2 protons, and you would go completely into a different species. Okay, all right. So it is not possible to do that. Okay, so the only way in which you can decay is through gamma radiation, and as it turns out, depending upon these quantum numbers over here, which are the angular momentum and the parity, these are things which think of them as some kind of an address for this level. Based on these things, you cannot decay readily through gamma radiation. So now given this, the fact that these energies, look, this is 18.15 MeV above the ground state level. That's a very high energy. Similarly, 17.64 million electron volts, again a very high level. What do I mean by high? It is much higher than the energy, the rest mass energy of the electron. The electron is half an MeV, and the electron's brother, the positively charged electron, which is called the positron, also has half an MeV. So in principle, I could decay from here to here or from here to here, both through gamma radiation and through something known as internal pair conversion. That is to say, I could spontaneously create an electron and a positron pair. The electron and positron pair would be energetic, because whatever is left over after converting some part of this total energy into rest mass of electron and positron, the remaining energy is available as kinetic energy. So this is something known as an internal pair conversion process. Now there is, I have written down over here, there is something called a branching ratio to gamma, which is, that is about 14 times in 1 million interactions or 1 million de-excitations, I emit a gamma ray. The branching ratio to this internal pair conversion is about 1000 times weaker than that. Actually not quite 1000, because this is 5.5, so, but whatever, it's close to, more than 100 times weaker than decaying to gamma. And gamma itself is only decaying some 14 times in a million. I mean, the gamma radiation comes out of here. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is, you pump and pump and pump, you populate, and most of the time you do not get these transitions either through gamma radiation or through internal pair conversion. Okay? So these are rare events, and when you have to study rare events, then you have to be that much more careful. That's the key thing that I want you to understand. So what can you study about the things that emerge from a bombardment zone? You can find out particle identity, energy of the particle, direction of emission. I told you the multi-wire proportional counter, which can tell me the x and y coordinates of each particle that has gone through it, and very important, timing. So supposing you had an internal pair conversion, electron-positron pair getting generated over here. That pair is getting generated at the same time. Both members of the pair are getting generated at the same time, the electron and the positron. So by supposing in your detection system, you saw an electron coming at some point and some positron coming about one minute later. They are obviously not related to each other. Okay, but if both of them came within the, let us say within a nanosecond of each other, you know that they are related to each other. They are very likely to be related to each other. Random events cannot have given rise to an electron in one case and a positron in another case coming essentially at the same time. So timing is important, and timing helps you actually, so timing and identity, you can identify that an electron came here, a positron came over there, so that identity, the timing, the energy, all of these are useful to tell you whether you have seen an internal pair creation process. Now these Hungarian scientists focused their attention only on those decays that gave rise to internal pair conversion, and they did it through timing coincidence and energy summing. So this is, if you remember, I had shown you details of the detector, and all of these things are possible over here. Okay, that is the timing coincidence as well as the energy summing as well as the identity. In addition, they studied something called the angular correlation of the emitted pairs of electron and positron and electron. So what is this thing called angular correlation? Now I want to, oh dear, yeah, okay. So the angular correlation coefficient for internal pair conversion is something for which a theory was given in 1949. And that theory has been confirmed with fantastic levels of precision. It's a very precise theory, and it tells you the relative distribution of decays based on the angle between the electron and the positron. So if I have an electron going in this direction and a positron going in this direction versus if they go very close to each other or they go very far from each other, that angle between the two directions of emission, that is the thing that is plotted over here. And this is the relative rate at which we get production at a particular angle of choice. Okay. So what can I say about this? That this distribution over here is basically peaked at small angles. But out by about 20 degrees, I have fallen by a factor of about 10. By about 40 degrees, I have fallen by a factor of 100. And I am getting almost to about 1000 times less than that peak, or several hundred times less than that peak when I am out beyond about 100 degrees. That is, electron going this way, positron going more than 100 degrees away, very, very unlikely. Okay, that's the bottom line over here. This is for the particular kind of decays that is involved over here as well as over here. These are what are called M1 transitions. Actually, the M1 transition is for the upper excited state of beryllium 8 to the ground state, not the lower excited state. Okay, so this is what you expect on the basis of theory for internal pair conversion. Okay, so what are they doing? The experimental physicists are measuring these pairs, measuring the angle between them, and recording this over days and weeks. Okay, the experiment takes a long time, basically because there are rare phenomena. And then they plot how many did we get at 1 degree, how many did we get at 2 degree separation, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, etc. And then they get a graph. Okay, so now, yeah, so I just want to underline for you the difficulty of the experiment. These detectors are set up in the orthogonal plane rather than in the beam direction. So what are you doing? You're sacrificing a large geometry for collection of particles, right? I mean, you're looking in this slice rather than looking all around. Why are you doing that? Basically, you're doing that because the beam itself creates a lot of noise. So it creates all kinds of spurious other particles. There is a huge number of protons coming in that beam, and you don't want to be disturbed by that. So you are improving the quality of the data, but you're doing it at the cost of the statistics. Now, as I remember that I had told you about the branching ratios, and internal pair conversion events are already 55 in a billion in unrestricted geometry. Here now we are restricting the geometry, so we have even smaller numbers. Now, I just want to show you through this diagram what I had been telling you earlier. This angle being small is what is expected for the angular correlation of E plus E minus pairs from the internal pair conversion. But what did the experimentalists see? These things, each one of these dots with a vertical line and a horizontal line, these are error bars in the IPC coefficient, and this is error bar in the angle. Every measurement that you make only within certain levels of precision. So of course there are error bars associated with these. Each one of these dots is an experimental data point. Now this angle is from 80 degrees to 180 degrees. Remember what I had shown you here earlier, this was for the entire range from 0 to 180. So we are actually in that particular plot we are looking in this zone only, right, 80 degrees to about 180 degrees. And the experiments actually found that these data points are not falling along this nice smooth curve which is continuously falling. Instead, it seems to have a little bit of a bump. So this is a surprise. And what does that surprise mean? So first of all, I want to underline for you what is the geometry telling us. That instead of that angle being small, that angle has become large. That is, there is a substantial number at a relatively large angle. Okay, and now this is my cartoon version of the same, this very nice and respectable experimental actual data points. I am trying to give you a cartoon version of this. So we had expected something like this red curve. Instead, we are getting something which looks like the red curve plus this blue curve added on top of it, right? So it is this expected red curve and the unexpected blue curve. And this unexpected blue curve is peaked at around 140 degrees. So I'm just trying to show you graphically what that other data looks like. And I want you to pay attention to the fact that there is one red and one blue. Okay. Now, what is the explanation that people give for this process? So along comes the proton beam. this particular thing. I'm just trying to look at it in the detail. The proton beam is coming along, it excites it places the lithium plus proton into a beryllium excited state. And the hypothesis is that there is something called an X particle, which is what the excited state of beryllium decays into. And if that X particle is a very heavy particle, remember that the energy of that excited state was like 18 MeV. So if this particle that is created is very heavy, let us say it is some 17 MeV, then there is only 1 MeV left for the kinetic energy of the movement of the X particle. It is a very slow moving particle in the lab frame. Okay. Now, what happens when the X particle then subsequently decays into an electron and a positron? Since it's a slow moving particle, let us try to guess what will happen if that slowness is actually equal to zero velocity. At that point, all the energy that is available, the rest mass energy that is available to the X particle is given off into rest mass energy of these two plus the kinetic energy of these two. But we have to satisfy certain conservation laws. One of those conservation laws is the conservation law of momentum. So whatever momentum is delivered here, an equal amount of momentum has to be delivered there, because this fellow has no momentum, right? So in the lab frame, I'm trying to say that it is at rest, right? So I'm taking that particular case where this is essentially almost at rest. So there's no momentum here, and the sum of this momentum plus that momentum, the vector sum, must also be equal to 0. So the consequence of this argument is that the electron and the positron must be emitted in opposite directions in the lab frame. Okay, so this is a way of getting a large angle, a large opening angle. So this is the seed of this explanation. That is, some new particle has gotten created, the X particle, and then that subsequently decays into an electron and positron. So essentially, I think you can understand why this explains why that there are large opening angles. And what is the kind of X particle that is needed? It needs to be fairly heavy, because if it were very light, then it would be moving very rapidly, and then my old argument, that entire argument which said that this X particle is almost at rest and the electron and positron have to be emitted opposite to each other, that won't work anymore. Okay? So now the data seems to suggest that two different processes produce the electron-positron pairs. One set of production is from the standard internal pair creation process, and the other is that there is this new process caused by the existence of a new X particle. And the data are extremely well fit, and the conclusion of the Hungarian experimenters is that the hypothesis of an X boson with a mass of 16.7 plus minus some statistical error plus minus some systematic error in MeV yields the best fit to the data. And for those who have done a little bit of statistics, there is something known as the chi-squared per degree of freedom. Your data looks like it is not suspicious, not unsuspicious. It is just the right kind of amount of error that is sitting around if the chi-squared per degree of freedom is close to 1. So this is an excellent fit in the eyes of anybody who has to look at the data. Okay. Now there's one more question that remains to be asked. Could there be some kind of background fluctuation which has done it? Yes, that is always possible. But the overall probability of this happening in that particular experiment is 5 parts in 10 to the power 12. Okay. So very unlikely. If you want to say it in Hindi, you can say nahi ke barabar. It's very, very unlikely to happen this way. What remains as a possibility, however, is that this systematic error, which they have estimated to be this much, there might be something that is going on in their apparatus which they have not understood well enough. Okay? This is always a hazard for experimental physics, experimental anything. Okay? You can try to run an election, you can make a plan, and you have missed out something which is very important. You failed to feed people, and you expect votes from them, right? So of course you will go very badly wrong in the election process. So you have to be able, somewhere in your apparatus, maybe there is something sitting around and you haven't understood it well enough, and that is why this particular bump in the data was visible, this particular bump. That is a possibility. Anyway, so this is what the Hungarians said. They published in January 2016, but the world did not seem to notice this sufficiently. Now, there is a set of American physicists, dominantly at the University of California at Irvine, who looked at the data again, and they did a theoretically more careful and complete analysis of this, and they concluded that there is good evidence for a new vector gauge boson. That is, vector gauge boson, remember those names I tried to tell you about 20-25 minutes ago? So there is a new interaction. And this new particle mediates a fifth force with a characteristic length scale of 12 femtometer or 12 Fermi. This is a very, very short distance. This is the size of a nucleus. Okay? A Fermi is the size of a nucleus, so 12 nucleon sizes, that's the range of this thing. If you go 4 times away from this, this force will have fallen almost to, almost to 1,000 times less, e to the minus 4, that's the kind of thing. Now, there's one more thing that they said, that the strength of this coupling is, in some invariant units, it is 10 to the minus 3 rather than 1. Okay? So, short range, it is very, very weak. I mean, it is a milli charge as opposed to the strong, which will be 1. And it has milli charge couplings to up and down quarks and to electrons, but with almost 0 couplings to protons relative to neutrons. And it also has very low coupling strength to neutrinos. So, this fact that it is suppressed with regard to protons is what leads them to call this force a proton-phobic. Protons pasand nahi hai usko. So it doesn't care to interact with protons. A proton may go by and another proton may go by. The two cannot talk to each other through an exchange of this particular gauge boson. Okay, so is this a bottom line? Now I have to talk about the community that I belong to. Physicists are conservative people. We don't like to very quickly agree with anything. Somebody comes and tells me something brand new and it goes against all my ideas. I say, no, you have to give me good evidence. Okay? So the evidence has to be very strong. One aspect of this is that if something can be independently re-verified, it must be done before we accept a revolution. And I just want to parenthetically tell you that in my opinion, that this fact, the fact that this cannot be done with big science experiments is actually, in my view, a big drawback. Some big experiment which is one of a kind, there's only one such experiment that can go on throughout the world. So for example, the Large Hadron Collider in CERN tells us that there is a Higgs boson. And there's nobody else who can go back and do an independent experiment to say yes or no. Okay, so there is a problem with this. LIGO tells us that they have seen gravitational waves. Okay, however much one may love what they have done, there is this problem. Has there been anybody else who has seen it? Until that happens, or until other kinds of evidence pile up and make us believe, we must be a little bit skeptical about it. So, in the case of this Higgs boson, it is sufficiently interesting and sufficiently accessible that there are new experiments that are planned which will look afresh at this idea, and this is a list of some of the experiments, and the references over here tell us about this is the experimental work. This is only the final announcement of their discovery in January 2016. They had other work where you can read the instrumentation papers and find out what they have done, how they have built the detector, how well it works in various ways and so on, testing that they have done of it. And this is the University of California people. They published in August 2016. Okay, so Deshpande ji perhaps saw those newspaper headlines maybe 15, 17, 19, 20th August, sometime like that. So he got very active about the whole thing, and so it's because of this paper and the fact that they are Americans and they are masters of hype, and so the newspapers get to know immediately and they start drum beating. So for example, when Americans do something in Syria, then it's all going on very well. But when the Russians do it, then the Americans come out and tell us that they're doing bad things, and so we all believe in all of that because our media also picks up on this. So that's the way it goes. Okay, but that's the reason. I mean, these are poor Hungarians. January, they did the work. They even came out with this suggestion, but people didn't pay enough attention. Well, of course, I have to also say that this paper is something which is substantially more comprehensive in terms of the theoretical work that has been done. Okay, so this is the part 1 of the lecture over. Now I seem to have eaten up a lot of time, so I'm going to have to run through this old story, the part 2, where 5 kilometers down from here, there was a set of people in TIFR. These are the names of the people. That's me. And so myself and Unni Krishnan, we were graduate students. This was my thesis advisor, and this was my co-advisor, both of whom are great physicists, great experimenters, people I respect a great deal. So this was the lot of us who were doing the physics. But there were other people, lots of other people working with us. As a group, we worked and we did this experiment searching for new forces using a torsion balance and a very sensitive experimental facility that we developed. Okay, and for some time after we published our results, they were absolutely the best in the world. Okay, so that's the thing I want you to take from this statement. If you listen to nothing more, at least take the fact that right here in our country, with limited budgets but with great ability, we were able to do something nice. Okay, so the reason why we got launched onto this, I joined as a graduate student in TIFR 5 years before 1986. Okay, but we had been developing this torsion balance facility, the instrumentation for it, the special underground lab and so on, because we had some other things in mind at that time. I will not tell you about that just now. But when this paper came out, also January of 1986, almost exactly 30 years before the Hungarian paper, they had reanalyzed an old experiment and they made the claim that apart from the interaction potential between two masses M1 and M2, which is the well-known gravitational interaction, there has to be some new interaction which has exactly that form which I was telling you about. It has a range and it has a strength. Okay, and what was the claim? These people said that it was coupling to something called hypercharge, and I will have some little bit to say about that a little later. The range, this lambda, is about 100 meters, and the strength alpha in relation to gravity is only about 1%. So it is 100 times weaker than gravity. That was their suggestion. As we went along and as other people jumped into the fray experimentally, it proved to be useful to think of this alpha 1, 2 as being parameterized in terms of some other charges, some new charge, not electromagnetic charge, not electrostatic charge, some other charge, okay, which couples to something. Maybe you can call it hypercharge, you can call it baryon number, you can call it nuclear isospin, whatever. This is a general format. So think of it like this: there is a piece due to gravity and there is a piece which is not due to gravity. But it could also be that gravity itself has been modified in this way. So if Q1, Q2 is just M1, M2, then it is just gravity which has been modified. Okay, all right. So in simple terms, the paper claimed evidence for a new force. Which paper? It is this paper of Fischbach et al. And they said it was 1% as strong as gravity, but with a range which is 100 meters. So the massive gauge boson had a mass only about a nano electron volt, and it would couple to this thing called hypercharge. And in the case where we had only ordinary matter, which is the case with most of the matter that we have on Earth, except when cosmic rays come in, or we create non-ordinary matter, strange matter, for example in accelerators, high energy particle accelerators. For all ordinary matter, this hypercharge is the same thing as baryon number. Now, I'm just going to make a statement here, and I hope people know about this, but if you have some question to ask me a little bit later. The baryon number, apart from the nuclear mass defect, is proportional to mass. If you wish, you can come back to this question and then I will hold forth on it a little bit later. So this is the situation as it stood in early 1986. What is plotted over here is the strength of the interaction, the new interaction, the alpha interaction, this alpha. So that's the strength of the interaction versus the range of the interaction. And because things over here, this is an old picture which is not very carefully photocopied. So I'll try and read out to you the scale. This is 1 meter. This is 10 to the power 3 meters, which is a kilometer. This is the radius of the Earth. This is the distance to the moon. This is the distance to the sun. So this is actually spanning a very large range. This is a 10 to the power 12 meters over here. Now this is a very, very busy graph. So I'll just try and tell you what does one curve of this kind mean over here. This, along this curve, the curve basically tells you something about measurements that have been made and numbers that are known. It says that if there is any new force with a strength alpha and a range lambda, then this particular pair, Earth surface and something called Lagios, that says that either the strength is okay, it says that anything in the region above this curve is ruled out by the experiment. You cannot have strong forces as well as range so much. Okay, so what is possible and available to you is the region below these curves. Okay, so this was some region of that parameter space. There are two parameters, remember, alpha and lambda, and physicists like to talk like the mathematicians once in a while, and so they say this is a parameter space. Okay, so within this parameter space, whatever is below these curves is allowed. Whatever is above has been ruled out by measurements that you have made. So let me just try and explain to you what are these measurements. I know what is little g, the acceleration due to gravity on the Earth's surface. I know, for example, Lagios is a satellite, and I know what is its acceleration as it goes around the Earth. So I know what is the acceleration, what is the gravitational force it is feeling due to Earth over there, and that's at some distance, maybe a few hundred kilometers above the Earth. So if gravity is not just looking like this, but it is also having another term like this, this term is not very seriously affecting the strength of the gravitational interaction at the surface, but at the location of Lagios it is seriously affecting it. And if I can make these measurements of little g at both locations, then I can say, oh no, it must be smaller than so much, it cannot be larger. Okay, so these curves are doing that kind of a job. Okay, so this particular location is where Fischbach et al. Claimed that, they were saying 1% of gravity, this is 10 to the power minus 2, and at about 100 meters. So this is where they said that the new force may lie. Okay, now we were setting up our underground laboratory in a place called Gauribidanur, which is about 100 kilometers north of Bangalore. It was a location chosen for many different reasons. One of the reasons is that it is equidistant from the two oceans, and tidal disturbances several hundred kilometers away are just about okay for doing these sensitive experiments that we had in mind. Okay, it's an arid zone, so there is very low precipitation, very little amount of rainwater coming, very little dew fall. Dew, when it falls, it represents a mass on the ground, and that mass comes in the morning, comes at night and goes away as the sun comes out. So it is periodically going up and down. This we didn't want. And this is a seismically quiet site, this location over here. It is actually superior to the LIGO sites in the US. Okay, the underground lab in Gauribidanur, this is the building that we have, and down below, because I can't take a cross section through the earth, I have just added this graphic over here. 80 feet below the ground, we have bedrock, and we set up our apparatus over here. The lab was ready in late 1986. And this is a line diagram of the same thing. What you see over here is that there is an ultra high vacuum chamber, this thing called UHV chamber, and there's a torsion balance suspended inside it. These other things, some of them I've already told you about. And we wanted to do very sensitive mechanical experiments. So we use ultra high vacuum. At that time, this was one of the highest vacua obtained anywhere in the country, and pretty much what was the state of the art elsewhere in the world. We had very good thermal isolation, very good magnetic isolation. The torsion balance, just a few words about this. This is something that people probably have last met with in school. Some people may have met with it in college as well. But basically, what is the idea? You have a dumbbell, you have a mass here and a mass there, and you have a thin torsion fiber over there. I want you to note a few important things, that it's an extremely sensitive transducer. Even today, it is one of the most sensitive mechanical transducers that we have. It can make measurements of a relative difference in acceleration of these two balls, which are as small as 10 to the minus 13 centimeter per second squared. It it can make a measurement of the torque imposed on this, which is as small as 10 to the minus 17 Newton meter. And we can make measurements in a system which is, basically a few kilograms. We can make measurements of energy being deposited in that system at the level of 30 micro electron volt per second. It's a very, very sensitive thing. And what did we do? What can you do with such a thing? Just imagine this is again a stick version of a torsion balance. There's a mirror over here, and as the torsion balance fiber, as this system undergoes a torque, the torsion fiber will twist, and the mirror will rotate, and you will be able to tell if you shine a light beam here, that reflected light beam will move back and forth, and you'll be able to tell exactly how much this is moving. Now this is a harmonic oscillator, a model of a harmonic oscillator. And if you had a source mass which was attracting this more strongly than that, then this would tend to get pulled towards the source mass. And if you move the source mass onto the opposite side, it would get pulled the other way. So as you move this round and round, you would be able to generate torques on this system, which are basically sending it back and forth. Now if you do this at the natural frequency of this harmonic oscillator, the amplitude of oscillation of the harmonic oscillator grows with time. So there's again something really wonderful that we built right there. It's an instrument for measuring angles, very, very sensitive. 3 times 10 to the minus 10 radians is an angle which is the width. The angle 3 times 10 minus 10 radians is, supposing you pluck a hair of yours and go and leave it in Pune, the width that it subtends over there is about this. It is actually, this is a number which is smaller than that angle. Okay, and so we wanted to set up this fifth force experiment. We had the tools for it, we had this vacuum chamber, we had the fine facility, and so here is a general schematic idea of that experimental system. So we had a system over here which was connected to a motor, and the motor would rotate, and so this mass would come towards us, and that mass would go away from us, and it would go round and round about this axis. Okay. Now there are some masses which are close to the torsion balance, some masses which are far from the torsion balance, and they would then be able to do this excitatory role which I was talking about over here, in case the fifth force existed. These masses were carefully calculated, and the distances, this is close by, that is far away, and these distances were carefully calculated so that if it was only gravity, then there would be no such excitation. But if there was a fifth force whose force law looks different from 1 by r squared, then there would be residual force due to the masses, and so the system would start growing in amplitude. And that was the key thing. I am going to be very quick over here. I want to skip. I'll probably just come down to results. But what I do want to tell you, that there are plenty of little clever ideas that we injected into this system to make it insensitive to gravity and gradients from gravity, and make it sensitive only to the one thing that we were most interested in, which is the existence of this fifth force. And so the next 2-3 slides tell you something about how we were trying to be clever, but I don't want to get into that just now. I want to show you a slide of the sensitive mass that we had. That, remember I showed a drawing over here which had this torsion balance mass. We did not make it in the shape of a dumbbell, because a dumbbell is actually the worst kind of mass that you can have. It reacts terribly to gradients, gravitational field gradients, and gives you wrong signals. So we had to symmetrize, and we ended up making something which was, this is what Professor Udgaonkar would have liked to say in very few words: compositionally a dipole, gravitationally a monopole. That's what we ended up doing, and this was clever. Okay, so even if I say it, it was not my idea. So I can feel proud of the person who came up with the idea, and it was a clever thing to have done. Now we chose to target one type of fifth force, and that was a coupling to nuclear isospin. We did a lot of experiments, and we kept improving our results, and we kept making a mark on the field. And here, in this particular strength versus range plot, this is a restricted range. This is 1 meter to 1000 meters. Over here, our first result was out here. That is to say, we ruled out anything above this. Now, it turned out that there were two experiments in the US. This was at Brookhaven National Lab, and this was from a group at the University of Washington at Seattle, who said they had actually seen a force. That is, after the Fishbach 1986 paper, these other people also jumped into the fray, and they came up and said, no, there is a force here. And these people also said, no, no, there's a force here. Okay, so our first result ruled out the T-Burger force. Second result, well, okay, it ruled out a large region of parameter space, but there's still this possibility of Professor Boynton at Seattle being right in this region. But then our third result actually ruled this out. Okay, so now the TFR constraints on a fifth force coupling to nuclei isospin stood for several years as the tightest limits imposed anywhere. Please note, I am choosing a particular charge, nuclear isospin. I'm not saying that our constraints were with regard to all kinds of forces, all kinds of charges. So in this particular region, we were the best, and we remained that way. And so I will end by just telling you that good and even excellent experimental work can be done in our country. Joining large collaborations outside is not the only model available. You don't have to join CERN, you don't have to join LIGO. You can do good experiments. You can do it right here. Okay? And we have good people in this country. There are good young people, there are good older people, and all that is needed is a dedication to wanting to do good science. And you can do it here. So I'll stop here.
So any questions?
What are the project costs like? Let's say the Hungarian team, what kind of project costs are you looking at here and your team in 86 and so on, just for an idea.
So in 86, roughly speaking, we would have ended up spending something like 40 lakh rupees.
For the building and everything.
For building, yeah, that's quite a lot of money. In that era, it was a lot of money. So it was not cheap, but it was also money which was spent on building facilities which remained in our country and which remained essentially as infrastructure and remain. So the vacuum chamber, the optical lever, that optical lever which I mentioned to you, which is capable of measuring very, very fine angles, it's still an operating instrument in our lab. The vacuum chamber is still an operating vacuum chamber.
It's still being used for experiments.
Yeah, we still use it.
And what about the Hungarian people? How much do you think they?
I don't know. So this is, okay, see, I'm not a nuclear physicist. So I had to read a lot about their work only in a bid to come and talk to you about it. Okay. So, but I would say, just hazarding a guess, the total amount of money involved in building their apparatus and so on, including the detectors. Some of the detectors are very sophisticated and very expensive. They use high purity germanium. So I would say a few crores. Of course, there is a background, which is apart from the detector, which is the Van de Graaff accelerator, the beam pipe, and so on and so forth. That's a lot of infrastructure, and that would be tens of crores. PFR has an electrostatic accelerator, which is known as a Pelletron. It's been in operation since the late 1980s. It's also expensive. But there are things which have been built around it right here in our country by our people, right? And they have, in the process, developed expertise. They have developed other human beings with expertise, right? So you can spend money. I'm not, science anyway, or anything that you have to do ends up needing money. But it's good if that money helps develop things here.
So maybe I can understand it. So what is the conclusion? Is there a probability of there is a fifth force,
So I would say that if I just looked at these data, and if I believed that there are absolutely no other systematic effects, then first of all, the Hungarian experiments suggest that there is a force. Okay? I cannot rule it out on the basis, oh, there is this particular thing that you failed to take account of. That bump over there is a very real bump. And it would be a very strange thing if that bump happened because of a collusion of several other phenomena and gave rise to something which looks so much like the evidence of a new boson. Okay, but these things happen. Physics, I don't know if you know this, but about 4.5 years ago, the world of physics was in a great turmoil because there was an experiment done with a beam from CERN which suggested that neutrinos move faster than the speed of light. I don't know if you remember this. Superluminal motion, right? Yeah, and the world of physics was just basically in turmoil for some time. How can this happen? Okay, I mean the one theory that we have the greatest faith in, the theory of special relativity. It turned out that there was a very trivial, almost silly mistake which was made by these people, that some cable that was involved in connection between detector and the electronics which read the signal from the detector, that was of a length which was different from what they had thought. So there are cable delays, and so they had made mistakes in accounting. So things happen, things can go wrong, and it's not because they are intentionally trying to make a mistake. It just happens, right? So I have great respect for people who do experiments and do it carefully and analyze it as carefully as these people have done. But there is still a possibility that things may be out. Okay, I want to say one more thing in this context, that the Americans, when they went through this, they tried to look at this hypothesis in terms of what it would mean in other situations. If this X boson exists, then obviously it must have an effect in other places. Is it in contradiction with what is going on elsewhere? And they found no contradiction. So it's not possible to rule it out on those grounds. So I would say, let's go back here to Jefferson Lab and this Novosibirsk lab and the Large Hadron Collider. I gave you a list of 3. Where did I say? Yeah. So there's this Jefferson Lab dark light experiment at LHC in CERN, and then the Frascati Lab as well as the Butker Institute at Novosibirsk. All of them are planning to do things. This will not happen quickly. These are much more major experiments than one might imagine. This particular experiment is the earliest likely to get online, and it will only be sometime after January or February next year. So we will have to live in this state of ambiguity and concern. Is there an X boson force or not for that much time at least? Yeah.
If it happens to be true, this hypothesis is supposed to be positive,
Yeah.
then what thing will be changed in the theoretical framework?
Yeah. So, okay, I must say that the theoretical framework, however much particle physicists want to tell us that the standard model is something fixed, we already know things which are outside the standard model which are experimentally verified, right? I mean, so there is something related to. Are you a particle physicist?
No.
No. Okay, so I'm trying, and then I'll have to try to find the words to talk about it. Just take it from me that there are things which are already known which do not fit in within the framework of the standard model, and so people have to put in some patchwork, and still you can use the predictive power of the standard model where it works, and elsewhere you put in the patchwork. So that will happen. Now notice also that I said that they had told us that there are milli-charge couplings. They're very weak, and this range is also very small. So in most phenomena, this is not going to have any effect. It's a very weak thing, right? The fact that it is also coupling very poorly to neutrinos is something which means that in that sector also we are not likely to have anything happen. But ultimately, you do want to have some unifying picture, and there things will have to change. They are not going. This is not going to cause anything in the universe in the large. Okay, there's one, apart from one thing, which is that it is possible that this vector gauge boson, its sole purpose of existence is to actually cause interaction between dark matter particles. Okay, we don't know what the dark matter is. There is no, there are theories about it, but we don't know what it is. So this guy does not react with matter. Maybe he reacts with dark matter. And in fact, that was the purpose of this dark light experiment. That was the whole idea. So, okay, so this is not an experiment which started getting set up just because of the Hungarian results. This is an experiment which was planned anyway, and it was intended to look for gauge boson masses between 10 and 100 MeV. The X boson, the new one, is 16.5, 17 MeV. Okay? So this is supposed to be probing a much larger range, and this is a big experiment. Already people had been theorizing about this, that possibly there is something which makes dark matter react with dark matter. So there it will have effects explaining to us what is happening in the universe in the large, because the universe in the large is dominated by dark matter.
I have a question on this dark matter. It's a slight digression. If there is dark matter, and they say that actually most of the matter in the universe is dark matter, how come none of our missiles or our satellites run into the dark matter?
Alright, so good question. The two things I just want to say. One thing is that most of the mass energy in the universe is not dark matter. It is supposed to be something else, which is dark energy. No, so these are different things, and the dark energy may be something completely, entirely different, and it has very strange properties. That is, it is what seems to be causing the universe to expand away more rapidly. Okay, acceleration of the expanding universe. However, dark matter is 5 times more abundant than visible matter. So in that sense, the point that you're making is correct. Now, depending upon what this dark matter is, regardless of what it is actually, the densities are not terribly high. It's just that it is spread everywhere. So the volumes over which it is spread are so enormous. So when you talk about Earth over here and the next nearest planetary object, which might be one Earth-Sun distance away, or you have a satellite at the distance of the Moon, that's a long distance. Now there is no visible matter between us, but that's all filled up with dark matter. Okay, at very low densities, but it is there, and that is why the total mass in dark matter is large. Okay, now if you don't have very high densities of the dark matter, then of course it is like moving a missile through air. It's not reacting because it's just too low in density. Of course the missile is getting slowed down. There is aerodynamic drag as it is moving through the air. So it's not even at the density of the atmosphere. Okay, so the dark matter that you have, it is not agglomerated in clumpy amounts. So you have a dark matter planet here and a dark matter sun over there and a dark matter moon. No, it's not like that. It's just a very thinly spread fluid, if you like. I'm using the word fluid. It's not a fluid, but that's what it is.
Can I just ask one last?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, at some point you mentioned that, you were at the cutting edge of, at least at some point,
Yes.
you as Indian
Yes.
scientists were at the cutting
Yes.
edge of a narrow part of this investigation.
Yes.
So where is India in this frame 30 years down the line?
So this is something that you move on, right? So you don't want to continue to do that for the rest of your life. So having done something which seemed to be of great importance at that time, we just moved on.
No, I mean,
And
that's
there are no others.
Okay.
No, nobody else. No, so there's just nobody else. Targets exactly this area.
But you went at it from a gravitational
Correct.
angle, and
Correct.
these people are going from a nuclear angle.
Correct.
So our nuclear scientists are they investigating these?
So to the best of my knowledge, nobody in nuclear physics in the country today is trying to address this issue. These, they are not small things that you take up, and not at the snap of a finger that you can turn around. And you take our case also. It just happened that from 5 years prior to this announcement by Fischbach, we were already planning to do experiments in this domain. Right? So it was an easy thing for us to move off, drop what we were aiming to do, and try and address this issue, which was topically important. Okay. Now, having said this, I want to also underline for you the fact that this particular area is an area which has some history. That is, within nuclear physics, looking for a particle like this it is at least 30 years old, that people made this point that if you look uh, in nuclear systems where there is internal pair conversion, and you look for this angular correlation between the electron and the positron pair that are emitted over there, then you could have a handle on the existence of bosons. So this is an area where people have been working internationally over this 30-year period. I don't think anybody in India started doing this at that time. We have had, our nuclear physicists end up doing other things. Some of them do bread and butter stuff. Finding out, for example, when I say bread and butter, you remember that I was showing to you this thing, the level system. So people actually spend a lot of their time finding out lots of details over here. Okay? So that's the kind of thing, to my knowledge, that nuclear physicists have been working on. There have been very interesting experiments done in TIFR in nuclear science, but this particular thing I don't think has been addressed.
Why that lithium fluoride or lithium iodide is only used for this?
Yeah, lithium fluoride and lithium oxide, I don't know why. So this, again, I can tell you that having got that, they then made use of it in clever ways. That is, they use the fluorine content in some targets, the oxygen content in some targets, to actually calibrate the detector. Because, it's not just lithium which has level systems, not just beryllium which has nuclear level systems. Oxygen has its own level system, fluorine has its own level system. It's not just that. There's something even more interesting. So what I'm trying to say is that, these are detectors. You come there and put them all together in the best of faith. Are they working as well as you expect them to work? Just because you put them together, you don't know. So you have to do some calibration experiments. And if there are known levels over here and known gamma ray energies and so on, then you can pick up the signals from those and ask whether the detectors are actually giving you exactly those levels, right? So that's the reason why they might have picked up lithium fluoride and lithium oxide may be as simple as something that says it is possible to get it. You write to a chemical company, they will sell you with high purity, they will be able to sell you lithium fluoride and lithium oxide. Maybe it's that. Maybe it has to do with the ability to actually deposit it on some substrate over here. See, the target itself, these targets are extremely thin. Okay, because you want one proton coming in, interacting with one fellow, or not interacting, just going on. You don't want the proton interacting with one fellow, interacting with something, and you then get a mess out of the whole process. You don't want that. So these targets are actually on the order of microns in thickness. So how do you do it? You have a substrate which is very thin, and on that you evaporation coat this particular material. So there may be mechanical reasons why it was why these things were chosen. I'm sure the nuclear physicists will know, and they might even be laughing at the kind of answer I'm giving you, but there would be reasons like this that I know.
Good. So it is said that taste of the pudding is in its eating. How much the lecture is absorbed by people gets resulted into asking the questions. And good number of questions were asked. We don't know, as you said, 5 kilometers, little bit exorbitant, but very close from here. Institution, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, people are working there. We do not know exactly what they are working on, which subject they are working, how far they are ahead in the world, are they state of the art, and all those things. So taking such lectures over here, Mr. Sharad Kale keeps on reading many things. He suggests me the subjects, and I locate the people. And that is how the phenomena takes place. Good that all of you have come. Please keep on coming. I must thank Professor Krishnan for having explained this very complicated subject in a lucid manner, so that some people got provoked to ask the questions. Our next lecture will be on the black holes on 16th of November at 5 p.m. by Professor Yadav from TIFR. Please do come in good number. Thank you.
Thank you. So I do want to thank everybody here and the YB Chavan Center and Marathi Vigyan Parishad.